The whole city knows that Cedric, the head of the Zhou group, is an outright madman. Gloomy, paranoid, rivals pale at the mention of his name, and insiders privately call him Cedric the Yenluo. Yet no one knows that in the most secret drawer of his study lies a faded high school group photo, its edges worn fuzzy from constant handling. After that woman left 5 years ago, he turned the entire Zhou group into her shadow, acquiring every building she passed, buying every shop where she drank coffee, like a mad dog without a bone, able to breathe only by tracking her traces. Until she appeared at my banquet again. She had lost weight, her gaze even colder than before. I stood 3 meters away, daring not to approach, the veins on the back of my hand nearly bursting through my skin. 5 years ago, I only knew how to lock her up. Now I finally understand that was stupidity. A true madman should learn how to grind himself into a blade to stand in front of her, not hold the knife against her neck. The day the rival came for her, I dropped a 300 million contract and rushed over. I heard the sound of bone cracking clearly as the steel pipe smashed into my shoulder, but I didn't feel any pain. When she stood behind me crying, I felt my life was worth it. Don't be afraid, I won't touch you this time. I stood in the shadows watching her, too lazy to care that the blood from my left shoulder had soaked through my shirt. As long as you are somewhere I can see, even if it's just a distant glance at me. But later she threw those letters in front of me, her eyes red as a rabbit. Only then did I realize that she hadn't left the stage all these years either. The air conditioning in the banquet hall was turned down extremely low, the crystal chandelier pouring down millions of cold rays, slicing through every hypocritical face amidst the glamour and perfume. Selena stood in the corner, the rim of her champagne glass pressed against her palm. She had changed into a simple black dress, the satin fabric clinging to her back, attempting to blend completely into the crowd. But when that familiar sense of oppression approached from behind, the hairs on her back stood up instantly. The body remembered fear more faithfully than the mind. Cedric stopped half a meter behind her. He didn't speak, but that gaze of a predator locking onto its prey made Selena's breath hitch. 5 years, and the cold, crisp scent of sandalwood on him hadn't changed a bit, mixed with a faint trace of tobacco, enveloping her like an invisible, airtight net. He was thinner than before, his suit shoulders sharp and structured, like a blade sheathed in its scabbard. "Miss Selena, long time no see." Cedric's voice was low and husky, carrying the magnetic resonance of an adult male. Selena turned around, her gaze colliding with the depths of his eyes. He had lost a lot of weight, his cheekbones sharp and prominent like knife blades, and those eyes that had once made her drown and suffocate were now bloodshot. He was clearly smiling, yet the curve of his lips was filled with a madness bordering on collapse. He suddenly reached out, his fingertips brushing past the shell of her ear. The scorching heat made Selena instinctively tilt her head. He forcibly tucked the stray hair by her temples behind her ear. The movement was too fast, and Selena clearly saw the veins bulging on the back of his hand. He was restraining himself, and this restraint itself was more terrifying than anger. "Mr. Cedric, please mind the occasion." Selena avoided his hand and set the wine glass on the long table, the base making a soft clink against the marble surface. 5 years later, and your manners have regressed." Cedric withdrew his hand, shoved it into the pocket of his dress trousers, and tilted his head to study her. That gesture was exactly like when he was in senior year of high school, sitting behind her and poking her back with a pen cap to force her to turn around. Only now, the youthful mischief had settled into something far more dangerous. "Upbringing?" He laughed softly, his chest vibrating. "Selena, I spent 5 years learning one thing. Upbringing won't bring you back. So now I can give up everything." Selena's fingernails dug into her palms as she lowered her lashes. "Mr. Cedric controls the entire Zhou group. Why insist on a past from our student days?" "The past?" He interrupted her, leaning in close, the scent of sandalwood overwhelming her. "Selena, do you think that escape really ended?" The summer night from 5 years ago struck her mind like a bolt of lightning. The rain poured down in torrents. Selena dragged her suitcase, trembling outside the Zhou family villa. The rain soaked her hem, and every step felt like wading into a swamp. It was her last attempt to escape. Cedric stood in the rain. The 18-year-old boy had grown tall and slender, his school uniform shirt clinging to his body as rainwater streamed down his sharp jawline. He didn't roar, nor did he grip her wrist tightly as he had before. He simply stared at her, letting the rain flood his throat, his face turning gradually pale, his lips assuming the deathly white of the dying. He opened his mouth, choking out rain and words together. "Selena, you can't escape." She remembered the look in his eyes. It wasn't anger. It was fear. Pure, drowning fear. "You can only die within my sight in this lifetime." The suffocation from that moment became a nightmare that haunted Selena for 5 years. Countless late nights. She woke up startled in a cold sweat, the sound of rain pounding against the asphalt ringing in her ears, accompanied by the boy's hoarse, nearly pleading declaration. "Mr. Cedric, that is all in the past." Selena spoke, her voice striving to remain steady, though the tail end trembled slightly. She took half a step back to create distance. "I have my own life and career." Cedric's hand gripped the back of her neck. His palm was scorching, so hot it stung her eyes, the heat burning from her cervical spine all the way to the top of her head. He leaned in close, his breath spraying against the side of her neck, his lips almost brushing against the shell of her ear. His voice lowered to a volume only the two of them could hear. "Selena, look out the window." Selena looked over instinctively. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of the banquet hall, the city lights spread out like a sea of stars. Downstairs, beside the black Bentley, 4 men in black stood straight by the car, like wedges nailed into the ground. "I spent 5 years building the group to its current scale." His thumb glided slowly down her spine, resting in the hollow of her lower back, burning through the satin fabric. "Just so I would have the right to say, I won't let you run away this time. But I can wait for you to come back willingly." Selena's back stiffened. As she turned, she knocked over the champagne glass, pale golden liquid spilling across the snow-white tablecloth. "Crazy." The 2 words hissed through her teeth. Cedric smiled. That smile was pale, the red veins in the corners of his eyes reflecting the crystal light, like shattered diamonds trapped in a spiderweb. "Yeah, I'm crazy. I went crazy the day you left 5 years ago." He reached out to brush a speck of non-existent dust from her shoulder, a movement so gentle it was almost tender. "Take your time, Selena. We have plenty of it." He turned and walked into the crowd, his back straight as a blade, the crowd parting automatically to make way. Selena stood rooted to the spot, her knuckles white from clenching, her heart pounding painfully. 5 years. She thought she had buried those days in the ground. But Cedric lifted the thin blanket, and underneath, everything was still festering, unhealed. As the banquet drew to a close, Selena left early. Pushing open the door, the early summer night wind, heavy with moisture, rushed to meet her. She took a deep breath, trying to expel every trace of Cedric's sandalwood scent from her lungs. The click of her high heels against the marble steps. She hurried toward the roadside to hail a taxi. A black Mercedes glided silently up to her. The rear window rolled down, and Cedric turned his head, the line of his jaw taut and cold under the streetlights. "Get in." "No need." Selena turned her face away. "It's 1:17 a.m. He glanced at his watch. "You won't be able to catch a cab in this area. You have a studio morning meeting at 9 tomorrow. You can't possibly walk back." Selena paused. How did he know her schedule? Cedric pushed open the door, got out, walked around to the rear door and opened it, his movements as natural as if he had rehearsed them 1,000 times. "Don't worry. It's on the way. The office building where your studio is located was acquired by Zhou's just last month. Starting tomorrow, we're essentially superior and subordinate." Selena's pupils suddenly contracted. He stood by the car door, half of his face submerged in the warm yellow halo of the streetlight, the other half sunk in shadow. Those bloodshot eyes looked at her across a span of 5 years, filled with an obsession that bordered on desolation. "Selena," His voice was as light as a sigh. "You can't run away. But I swear, I won't lock you up this time. I just want to be a little closer to you." The night wind rustled through the plane tree leaves. Distant headlights swept across the street. Selena looked at Cedric and suddenly felt he was like a poisoned blade. She knew getting close would hurt, yet the light on the edge was too dazzling. She got into the car. The moment the door closed, the scent of sandalwood surged once more through the confined space. Selena leaned against the window and closed her eyes. In the rearview mirror, Cedric's gaze was like a tangible shadow, clinging tightly to the side of her face. She knew that this reunion had only just begun. At the Monday morning meeting, the studio director announced the group's restructuring with a complicated expression. Zhou Capital was coming in with absolute controlling interest. Sparse applause echoed through the conference room, while only Selena sat in the corner, her fingertips turning cold. After the meeting, the director held her back privately. "Selena, President Cedric specifically requested that your project team report directly to him." "What?" Selena frowned. "The project team has a complete reporting chain. Headquarters decision." The director rubbed his hands together. "And President Cedric has arranged for new administrative support, for dedicated security guards, a shuttle bus, and a separate office area, claiming it's for the security of the core project team." Selena closed her eyes. Here we go again. The high walls and electric fences of 5 years ago had become today's security guarantees. A gilded cage was still a cage. That afternoon, for security guards in black arrived. Selena went to the pantry to get water, and one followed her like a shadow, staying 3 meters behind. When she stopped, he stopped too, expressionless and looking straight ahead. Colleagues cast curious glances, and Selena could only explain it as a new emergency mechanism allocated by the group. She dialed Cedric's number, and it was picked up after one ring, as if he had been holding the phone, waiting there all along. "Get your people out." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, followed by a low laugh. "Selena, your studio was targeted by a competitor last month. Someone staked it out 3 times. Did you think I didn't know?" Selena froze. "I don't care what you think." His voice dropped. "The security stays. You want to work, socialize, make friends. That's all fine, but I can't let anything happen to you again. This is imprisonment." "No." His voice came through the current, raspy with exhaustion. "Imprisonment was what I did back in senior year. Now I'm just ensuring your safety. Selena, you have no idea how hard it was for me not to take you away right there, and then when you stood before me in the banquet hall that night." Selena gripped her phone tightly, her knuckles turning white. "Just consider me a madman," Cedric said softly. "I went mad a long time ago anyway." The call ended. Selena stood before the floor-to-ceiling window. Downstairs, black-clad security guards stood rigid by the flower beds, like silent sculptures. Sunlight glinted off their sunglasses, casting blinding spots of light. She thought back to her senior year of high school. The Zhou family villa had installed an electric fence. The first time she tried to climb over, she was thrown back by the current, blisters forming on her fingertips. Cedric had sneaked into her room in the middle of the night, holding her hand under the lamp to apply medicine. The boy's lowered eyelashes cast delicate shadows on the back of her hand. He applied the ointment as gently as if handling porcelain. Yet, the very next day, the voltage on the fence was doubled. That was the kind of person he was, gently bandaging your wounds while simultaneously welding the cage tighter. Selena pressed her forehead against the cold glass and let out a long breath. On Thursday evening, Selena invited her college classmate and business partner, Vivian, to dinner. At the Riverside Japanese restaurant, Vivian had already ordered the sake. "Look at you." Vivian poured her a drink and leaned in to examine her. "Exhausted by Cedric?" Selena took a sip and didn't speak. Vivian was one of the few who knew the whole story. Back then, after Selena escaped from the Zhou family, she had stayed in Vivian's rental apartment for the final month before the college entrance exam. "He's coming on strong this time." Vivian picked up a piece of salmon. "Acquisitions, security, direct reporting. Much smarter than in high school. Back then he only knew how to lock you up. Now he's learned to use money and rules to keep you in check. There's essentially no difference. Selena put down her glass. But have you ever considered? Vivian looked at her seriously. If he really wanted to lock you up with his resources, you wouldn't be able to leave that office building at all. Yet you're going to work normally, socializing normally, and having dinner with me normally. Those 4 bodyguards at the door didn't stop you, did they? Selena frowned. What are you trying to say? He's changed a bit. Vivian refilled her glass. The obsession has shifted from locking you up to ensuring you stay safe outside. Does that count as progress? Selena fell silent. A cruise ship drifted slowly across the river. Its lights reflected in the water and shattered into fragments by the ripples. I don't need his protection, she finally said. I just need him to disappear. Vivian sighed and didn't press any further. The turning point came faster than anyone had expected. On Friday evening, Selena's project team was conducting a field survey at the suburban development zone. It was a plot that the Zhou group had just won at auction, planned for a cultural and creative park. Selena and 2 assistants were conducting a structural assessment in the abandoned factory building. The early summer dusk was stifling, and the air was tinged with rust and concrete dust. The trouble struck at the end of the workday. Just as Selena descended the stairs from the 3rd floor, she heard a commotion and the sound of metal clashing from downstairs. Her assistant, Elliot, rushed up, pale in the face. Selena, we're blocked downstairs. They claim they have a stake in this land and won't let us in. There are about a dozen of them, and they're all armed. Selena's heart sank. She pulled out her phone to call the police, but the screen showed no signal. The signal in this abandoned industrial zone was already weak, and the other party had clearly tampered with it. Go out the back door. She pulled the 2 assistants back. But the iron grate at the back door had been secured from the outside with a new chain. Footsteps echoed from the hallway, drawing closer. Selena pressed her back against the cold wall, her palms slick with sweat. Her assistant's eyes were rimmed with red. Selena shielded her behind her, her mind racing. The 3rd floor windowsill was about 6 meters from the ground, with overgrown bushes below. As she jumped, her phone suddenly vibrated. A name popped up on the screen. Cedric. She answered, and his urgent voice came through, accompanied by the sound of wind and engine roar in the background. Where are you? The location shows you're at that site in the development zone. Don't move. I'll be right there. How did you know I? Don't ask any questions. Find a room to hide in and lock the door. My people are 10 minutes away from you. I'm faster. The call cut off. Selena pulled the 2 of them back into an abandoned office on the top floor and slid the bolt on the iron door from the inside. Soon, the sound of banging came from outside, making the iron sheet vibrate with a hum. Selena gripped her assistant's icy hand, crouched in the corner, listening to the impacts striking her eardrums one after another. Then the banging stopped. In its place came a more violent commotion, the sounds of fighting, cries of alarm, and the dull thud of heavy objects hitting the ground. Selena peered out through the crack in the door. At the end of the corridor, Cedric stood against the light. His suit jacket had been discarded somewhere unknown. The sleeves of his white shirt rolled up to his forearms, and the backs of his hands were stained with dark smudges. He hadn't come alone. 3 or 4 security guards followed behind him, yet he was the one charging ahead. When he smashed his fist into the leader's face, that ferocity reminded Selena of a beast protecting its territory on a rainy night. He dodged a swinging steel pipe by turning sideways. The pipe struck his left shoulder with a dull thud, but he didn't even frown as he slammed the man against the wall. The situation was under control. Cedric walked straight toward the office where she was hiding. The iron door was bolted from the inside. He knocked twice, his voice extremely hoarse. "Selena, open the door." Selena drew the latch. The door pushed open, and Cedric stood outside. His white shirt splattered with dust and dark red, the fabric on his left shoulder worn through, the bruise underneath rapidly rising. His hair was disheveled, sweat beaded at his temples, but the moment his eyes fell on her, all ferocity faded, leaving only a greedy, relieved confirmation that she was unharmed. Are you hurt? He reached out to touch her shoulder. Selina took a step back. She stared at the wound on his shoulder, and her eyes suddenly burned. On that rainy night she escaped 5 years ago, 18-year-old Cedric had stood in the downpour until he passed out from lack of oxygen. It was just like this. Even at his limit, his gaze had locked stubbornly onto her direction. Are you crazy? Selina's voice trembled. That was a steel pipe. You took it with your shoulder. Cedric looked at her reddened eyes and suddenly smiled. That smile was filled with the exhaustion of a narrow escape and a cautious joy. As long as you're okay. He took half a step forward, and this time Selina didn't retreat. His palm landed gently on the top of her head, with a touch as light as if he were handling a recovered treasure. Don't be afraid anymore, Selina. I'm here. Selina's tears finally fell. For 5 years, she thought she had long since cried all her tears, but now standing in the devastated hallway, facing a man who had blocked a steel pipe for her, looking disheveled yet still smiling at her, all her defenses crumbled. She reached out to push him away, but her fingers instead clenched the front of his dust-stained shirt. Cedric took the opportunity to pull her into his arms, resting his chin against the top of her head, his chest vibrating with a long sigh. I'm sorry. His voice was buried in her hair. I wanted to take it slow, but when I heard something might have happened to you, Selina, I didn't care about anything else. The contract, the meetings, the group, none of it matters. I only have you. Selina cried out loud in his arms. It had been 5 years. She had hated him, run from him, and filled herself with work. Yet beneath all that hatred and flight lay something of equal weight. What was she afraid of? It wasn't imprisonment she feared, but that she would truly soften her heart. That night, Cedric drove her home. The car stopped downstairs. He didn't follow her up, but simply sat in the driver's seat, watching her walk into the building entrance. Selina walked to the corner on the second floor and looked back. His car was still parked there. The window rolled down, his profile reflected in the dim yellow light of the street lamp. The wound on his left shoulder had been bandaged briefly by a colleague, with a corner of white gauze visible from the collar of his shirt. He gazed in her direction, and through the glass, his look was tender, almost fragile. Selina hurried upstairs. But that night, she suffered from insomnia. At 3 in the morning, she turned on her computer and, as if guided by some unseen force, searched for attachment disorder. A large number of entries popped up on the screen: anxious attachment, separation anxiety, broken emotional pivots. Those terms crashed into her mind one by one. The more she read, the more awake she became. She didn't turn off the computer until the sky began to lighten, only to realize she had been sitting at her desk all night. 3 days later, a key was delivered to Selina. Cedric's personal assistant simply said, "President Cedric said there are some old things he would like you to help sort out," and then left. Selina stood before the iron gate of the familiar villa. The electric wires atop the high walls had been removed, replaced by rose vines climbing the perimeter, their pink and white buds swaying gently in the early summer breeze. She unlocked the gate, crossed the courtyard, and walked into the room that had once been locked for 3 months. The furnishings remained almost unchanged. The bed, the desk, the lamp. Only the bookshelf held many new books, mostly works on psychology and neuroscience. Selina's fingers brushed across the spines, and her heart sank bit by bit. She pulled open the bottom drawer of the desk. A thin layer of dust covered the iron box. Inside, on top, lay a stack of photocopies of medical records and psychological assessment reports. The diagnosis column read starkly: severe attachment disorder with anxious attachment style and borderline personality tendencies. The date on the report was the 3rd month after her escape. At the bottom of the page was Cedric's handwriting. The strokes of the youth had lost their childishness, yet they bore a distinct tremor. I dreamed again today that she ran away. The doctor says I can't rely on her to live. But without her, what is the point of living? Selina gripped the paper, her knuckles turning white. At the bottom of the iron box was a stack of never-sent letters. The envelopes were addressed to Selina, with postmarks stretching from 5 years ago all the way to last month. She pulled out the most recent one. The date was this year's Valentine's Day. Selena. Someone was selling roses downstairs at the office today. I bought a bouquet and put it in the passenger seat. I drove for 3 hours, but in the end, I still didn't dare go see you. I'm afraid you'll run away the moment you see me. The doctor says I need to learn to step back. But stepping back is so hard. It's as hard as asking someone not to breathe. I gave a speech at the group's annual meeting today, and hundreds of people below applauded, but I only found it noisy. Since you left, all the sounds in this world have felt distant from me. I just want to hear you speak, even if you're scolding me. Selena's hands began to tremble. She pulled out the second letter, then the third. Selena, I had someone look into your studio today. Don't be mad. I just wanted to know if you're doing well. You've lost weight. I had my assistant anonymously fund a project for the studio. Don't let on that it was me. Selena, I can't stop myself from scrolling through every post on your social media. You posted a photo of a latte last week, and there was a lipstick mark on the rim. That color drove me crazy for 3 days. But I can't come to see you. Selena, the doctor says I must establish new emotional anchors. But I've tried, and it's no use. You took all my emotional capacity away with you. Now I'm just a shell. Do I look good? This shell is worth quite a lot. The Zhou group's market cap has gone up again. Selena, I saw someone on the street today whose back looked just like yours. I followed them for 3 blocks. When they turned around and it wasn't you, I almost broke down and cried right there on the sidewalk. Selena sat on the cold floor, heavy tears splashing onto the letter and smudging the blue ink. The words blurred beneath layers of water stains, yet she finally saw everything she hadn't known for 5 years. Cedric used madness to mask his fear, possession to disguise his pleading. What he built with an entire commercial empire was nothing more than a space where she could live safely. He was so clumsy that he mistook imprisonment for protection, surveillance for keeping watch. But what lay buried beneath was too primal. A child utterly hollowed out by his family of origin, grasping at the only driftwood while drowning. Selena remembered their senior year of high school, the first time Cedric told her about his mother. That woman had dropped him off at the orphanage gate when he was 7 and walked away, never to return. When he was 12, his father took him back, providing him with fine clothes and lavish meals, but also day after day of neglect and harshness. He had never been caught securely by anyone, until Selena appeared. When she was explaining a problem to him, she casually said, "You're actually very smart," and he was stunned for the entire class. During gym class, she handed him a bottle of water, and he sat there clutching that bottle all afternoon. She was the first person to stay in his life, the first who didn't turn around and leave. So when she wanted to leave, he panicked. Someone who had never learned how to ask someone to stay could only use chains. Selena folded the letters one by one and placed them back into the iron box. As she stood up, her knees felt numb, and her blurred gaze swept over the top shelf of the bookcase. At the very top sat a copy of Attached, The New Science of Adult Attachment and How It Can Help You Find and Keep Love, its edges worn from being turned so often. On the title page was Cedric's annotation. Chapter 2. The foundation of healthy attachment is secure separation. The prerequisite for secure separation is that the person who is loved knows that even if they leave, the person who loves them will not disappear. Below, in smaller letters, it read, "I must learn to live as someone who will not disappear, even if she doesn't want me anymore." Selena walked out of the old house holding the iron box. The buds of the rose vines swayed in the evening breeze, and the twilight dyed half the sky red. She stood outside the iron gate and looked back. The house that had once trapped her was now just an empty villa. What had trapped her was never the walls and the electric fences, but the obsession of a child who didn't know how to love, trapping herself as well. She dialed Cedric's number. He picked up after the first ring. "Selena? The old house? Are you okay? Where are you?" Selena asked, her voice still sounding congested. "At the office in a meeting." "Why?" "Come to the intersection from 5 years ago." Selena interrupted him. "I'm coming to find you." Silence hung on the line for 3 seconds. Then came the sound of a chair being shoved back violently, footsteps, someone shouting, "Cedric, the executive meeting isn't over yet," and the loud slam of a door. "Wait for me." Cedric's voice had changed, laced with a desperate urgency she had never heard before, almost choking. "Selena, wait for me. I'm coming right now." Selena hung up the phone. The city lights outside the window streamed past, her fingers gripping the edge of the iron box tightly. When the car stopped at that intersection, the streetlights had just come on. 5 years ago, she had dragged her suitcase and run away from this very spot, a torrential rain turning the entire world into a blurry curtain of water. Now, the early summer breeze was light, and the plane tree leaves rustled overhead. She stood on the east side of the intersection. Across the entire zebra crossing, a black sedan screeched to a halt on the west side. The car door was flung open, and Cedric got out, his shirt collar askew, his tie hanging loosely around his neck, and his hair messy from the wind. He stood on the opposite side, looking at her across the road she had run across 5 years ago. He didn't come over. He just stood there watching her, as if waiting for a verdict. The light fell on his shoulder, and the white edge of a bandage showed from under his shirt. Selena took a step, then a second and a third. As she crossed the zebra crossing, headlights swept over her, but she didn't stop. Cedric's body tensed and leaned forward, but he didn't rush over. He stood rooted to the spot, his hands hanging at his sides clenched into fists, his gaze never leaving her for a moment. Selena walked up to him, and neither of them spoke. The evening breeze lifted the hem of her skirt and the corner of his shirt. She held the iron box out in front of him. "I saw everything." Cedric's pupils constricted sharply. His lips moved, his Adam's apple bobbed violently, and his voice was as raspy as sandpaper. You saw it all? He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, something was collapsing in those bloodshot eyes. Not madness, not possessiveness, but fear. He was afraid that after reading those letters, she would be even more certain that he was a monster. "Selena," his voice trembled, "if you find this frightening, you can leave now. I won't come after you. I promised." Selena looked at him. The streetlight hit him from behind, casting a fuzzy outline on his shoulders. The boy who had screamed, "You can't escape," in the torrential rain 5 years ago, and the man trembling all over as he said, "You can go right now," merged into one. She lifted her hand, her fingertips grazing the bandage on his shoulder. "Does it hurt?" Cedric froze. He lowered his head to look at her hand touching the wound, and his eyes instantly reddened. "Does it hurt?" Selena's voice was soft. "It hurts," he said, finally admitting it for the first time in front of her. "It always hurts, from the day you left." Selena stood on tiptoe and pressed her forehead against his jaw. Cedric's body stiffened for a moment, then all his restraint crumbled. His arms closed around her, pulling her into an embrace so tight it was as if he wanted to melt her into his very bones. Yet he was trembling all over, his weight sinking slightly, as if he could finally no longer hold himself up. "I'm sorry." He buried his face in her hair, his voice muffled and hoarse. "I'm sorry I locked you away for so long. Sorry I wouldn't stop chasing you. Sorry I lived like a monster. But I'll change. Selena, teach me how to love someone properly, and I'll change." Selena closed her eyes in his arms. The scent of sandalwood mixed with a faint medicinal smell. This time, she didn't want to run away. She raised her hand and wrapped it around his waist. "Cedric," she called him by his full name, her voice soft but steady. "I didn't come back to be locked up by you. Listen to me clearly. I'm staying because you're sick. You need treatment, and I'll go with you." His embrace tightened, but that tightness was no longer a confinement. It was the desperate, life-saving grip of a drowning person finally grasping the edge of the shore. "Okay." His voice rumbled from his chest, pressed against her ear. "I'll listen to you. Selena, I'll listen to whatever you say." The crosswalk signal turned off and on again, and traffic weaved through the night. Under the streetlight, The two held each other, like two trees growing from the same ruins, their roots long entangled, finally finding the strength to grow in the same direction. Selena looked up at his red-rimmed eyes. She reached out and wiped the corners of his eyes, her touch very gentle. "Don't cry." "I'm not crying. Your eyes are this red. Who are you trying to fool?" Cedric lowered his head to look at her and suddenly smiled. That smile was neither the near-frantic madness from the banquet hall nor the composed ease of the negotiation table. It was simply the smile of someone who had found what was lost again. Exhausted and gentle, finally able to touch the ground again. "Okay." He held the hand she had used to wipe the corner of his eye, pressed it to his lips, and kissed it gently. "No more crying. Never again." The evening wind rustled the plane tree leaves, and in the distance, the city lights merged into a warm sea of radiance. 5 years ago at this intersection, she had run away, and he had knelt in the pouring rain. 5 years later, at the very same intersection, she walked back. And this time, he finally dared to unclench his fist, opening his hand to wait for her. She took it,